Invade Earth, are you crazy, Galactic? Council new meeting. The motion hit the floor of the Galactic. Conclave like a stone dropped into still water. Ambassador Sikthara of the Vreth. Dominion had barely finished speaking when the chamber erupted, not in applause, not in debate, in something much closer to panic. The Vreth Dominion was a young empire by galactic standards, aggressive, efficient, and proud of both. They had absorbed 14 star systems in 2 centuries. They understood conquest. They understood strategy. What they did not understand was why the announcement of their latest target had turned the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy into a room full of frightened creatures. Sikthara stood at the center podium of Orenville, the great conclave station, orbiting a dying red dwarf at the galaxy's far edge. The chamber rose in tears around her, each level filled with representatives of the 7 founding species and 43 associate members. The air recyclers hummed the translation. Arrays glowed, and 50 different alien voices were all shouting at once. "You cannot be serious," said Elder Hawk Vuorn of the Hawk delegation, his 4 upper limbs raised in a gesture that translated roughly as absolute disbelief. "Withdraw the motion," said the Salandry representative, a tall silver-skinned figure named Orendas, his voice low but sharp. "Withdraw it right now." "On what grounds?" Sikthara demanded. She was young for a Vreth ambassador, barely 90 cycles old, with sharp yellow eyes and the calm confidence of someone who had never been told no and actually meant it. Terra 3 is an unprotected outer rim planet. Its inhabitants have only just developed interstellar propulsion. Their military technology is centuries behind the conclave average. The annexation would be straightforward. The word straightforward landed in the chamber like a spark landing in dry grass. 2 delegates from the Devorn, collective silicon-based beings that communicated through vibration, began producing a frequency that the translation array rendered as high-pitched alarm. A Hawk Jr. representative near the back quietly stood, gathered her data pad, and walked out of the chamber without a word. The Emrith ambassador, a creature that breathed liquid and communicated through color shifts, turned a deep and unmistakable shade of white. Sikthara looked around the room. "What is wrong with all of you?" The conclave chair, a massive 4-armed creature named Grand Arbiter Dolan Fass, pressed 2 of his hands flat on the podium. The chamber gradually quieted. He was older than most species in the room, and his voice carried the kind of weight that came not from volume but from experience. "Ambassador Sikthara," he said carefully, "I want you to understand that what you have just proposed is not being dismissed out of concern for the humans." He paused. "It is being dismissed out of concern for you." Sikthara blinked. "For us, for your people, for your fleet, for every soldier you would send and never see again." Dolan Fass leaned forward slightly. "The planet you are calling Terra 3 has a name. Its people call it Earth, and the conclave has been quietly watching it for 4,000 years. Then you know it is primitive." Sikthara said. "We know it is dangerous," Dolan Fass replied. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Sikthara looked at Orenda, who had not moved from his seat. The old Salandry was watching her with an expression she could not fully read. It was not quite pity, it was not quite fear, it was Something closer to the look a person. Give someone standing too close to a cliff edge who does not yet know it. With respect, Sikthara said, I have reviewed the intelligence files on Terra. 3. The population is approximately 9 billion. Their most advanced weapons are conventional, ballistic, and energy-based systems. Their space fleet is small and scattered. They have not yet unified their planetary government. They are, by every measurable standard, a fractured and developing civilization. Yes, said Orinda quietly, they are all of those things. He stood and the room gave him its full attention. They have always been all of those things, and yet here they are still. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. 60,000 years ago, a catastrophic event reduced their entire species to fewer than 10,000 individuals. Do you understand what that means, Ambassador? 10,000, a number so small that any reasonable projection model predict extinction within a few generations, and yet they recovered. They spread, they built, they grew. Sikthara opened her mouth. Orinda continued before she could speak. 40,000 years ago, another collapse. 20,000 years ago, another. Each time the species was reduced, scattered, left without the basic infrastructure of civilization. Each time they came back, not just to where they were before. Further, always further. He turned to face her directly. You are looking at their current state and seeing weakness. What I am asking you to consider, Ambassador, is that their current state is not their natural condition. It is merely the pause between what they were and what they are about to become. The silence in the chamber held for a long moment. Then Grand Arbiter Dahlin fast spoke. Again, his voice quiet and final. The motion to annex Terra 3 is formally suspended pending a full historical review. Ambassador Sikthara, you and your delegation will be escorted to the Deep Archive tomorrow morning. You will be shown what the Conclave knows about humanity. He met her eyes, all of it. Sikthara said nothing. Around her, the chamber began to quietly reassemble itself. Delegates exchanged words in low voices. Data pads passed between hands. The divan had stopped their alarmed vibrations, though the translation array still registered a faint background frequency. It rendered simply as worry. Sikthara stood at the center podium for a moment longer. She looked at the projection still floating above the chamber floor, a blue and green planet, small and quiet against the darkness of space. She had been a diplomat long enough to know when a room was afraid. What she could not understand, not yet, was why a room full of galactic civilizations was afraid of that. The Deep Archive was not a comfortable place. It existed 3 levels below the main conclave chambers, behind a set of reinforced doors that had not been opened for ordinary business in over a century. The corridor leading to it was narrow and dim, lit by long strips of pale amber light that made everything look slightly older than it was. The air was cool and dry and carried the faint taste of something metallic. Sikthara walked with 2 members of her delegation, General Oren, her senior military advisor, a broad-shouldered Vreth with 30 years of campaigns behind him, and analyst Deva, a young data specialist who had been taking quiet notes since their arrival on Orenville. Neither of them spoke as they followed Oren dazed through the corridor. The old Salin removed slowly but steadily, his long silver fingers trailing the wall as if drawing direction from it, he had said nothing. Since collecting them from their guest quarters that morning, he had simply appeared at their door at the agreed hour and begun walking. The doors to the archive opened without ceremony, no locks, no formal process. Just a slow, heavy movement, as though the doors themselves were reluctant. Inside, the room was round and surprisingly small. There were no windows. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with data cores, old ones in formats that predated most current technology. At the center stood a single wide table, flat and dark, which Oren Days touched once. The surface came alive with a soft blue glow. Everything you are about to see, Oren Days said, is drawn from 40,000 years of direct observation, hidden probes, deep-range listening stations, on surface monitors during certain historical periods. He looked at Sikthera. The conclave has watched Earth for a very long time. Why? She asked. Because we noticed them early, and once you notice them, you cannot stop watching. He pulled the first file. The surface of the table filled with images and data. Sikthara leaned forward. What she saw first was not a battlefield or a warship. It was an animal, a large four-legged predator, with heavy jaws and sharp claws, lying on its side with its head in the lap of a human child, eyes half closed, making a low rhythmic sound. What is that? General Oren asked. That animal is called a dog, Oren Das said. It is descended from one of the apex predators of Earth's prehistoric period. Humans domesticated it approximately 15,000 years ago. He paused. Not to eat it, not to use it as a weapon or a tool, to keep it as a companion. Oren stared at the image. They domesticated a predator. Several dogs, cats, smaller but still formidable hunters, horses, animals large enough to break bone with a single kick, falcons. In some cultures, they kept large constrictors in their homes voluntarily. Oren Das scrolled through images with quiet efficiency for companionship. Analyst David looked faintly unwell. This is not the part that concerned us, Oren Das said, and moved to the next file. What appeared next was a timeline, a long staggering sequence of catastrophic events mapped against the human population curve. Sikthara had seen population collapse data before. She had used it in military planning. When a population dropped sharply, the civilization typically followed it down. Trade collapsed, technology regressed, social organization failed within generations. The pattern was consistent across dozens of species in conclave records. Humans followed none of it. The line dropped, sometimes drastically. Then it rose every time, steeper every time. The event at approximately 70,000 years ago, Orenda said, indicating the earliest and sharpest drop on the timeline, reduced the entire human species to somewhere between 1 and 10,000 individuals. Modern genetic analysis confirms this. The variation in their current population traces back to a bottleneck that by every model we have should have ended them permanently. Sekora said nothing. They had no written language, no complex tools, no cities, no infrastructure of any kind. He looked at the table. They had firestone instruments and each other. He looked at her. 70,000 years later they have spacecraft. He moved to the next file without waiting for a response. This one was dense with technical specifications, weapon systems, energy Outputs delivery mechanisms, SECARA. Had enough background to read the numbers. The figures were significant. Not extraordinary by conclave standards, but significant for a civilization at their developmental stage. They developed fission-based weapons approximately 80 years ago by our current calendar, Orenda said. At the time, they had only recently begun to understand atomic structure. The development was rapid, extraordinarily. So, within a decade, they had weapons capable of destroying entire cities. Within 2 decades, they possessed enough of them to end their own civilization several times over. General Oren's expression shifted. And they chose not to use them. Oren blinked. There were close moments, Orenda acknowledged, moments where the decision sat in the hands of 1 or 2 individuals, moments where the difference between continuation and catastrophe was a single choice made in a control room at 3:00 in the morning by one person who was not entirely sure they were right. He brought up a specific file. On at least 3 documented occasions, a single human being made the decision not to act in defiance of their own protocols, knowing they could be wrong, and prevented an exchange that would have ended their civilization. He let that settle in the air for a moment. They built the most destructive weapons their science could produce, then spent decades trying to find ways to never use them. He closed the file. That is not the behavior of a primitive species, ambassador. That is the behavior of a species that is still deciding what it wants to be. Sixara was quiet. Beside her, Deva had stopped writing entirely. Orendas pulled one final file. The display reorganized into behavioral analysis, psychological profiles, documented patterns, historical case studies from across 4,000 years of observation. This is the section our researchers found most difficult to model, he said. Human psychology contains a trait that has no direct equivalent in any other species we have cataloged. The closest translation in your language is something like deliberate resistance at personal cost. He opened a subsection. Dozens of case studies filled the display. In their recorded history, humans have repeatedly taken actions that were objectively harmful to their own position, refused to withdraw when withdrawal was the logical choice, continued efforts when all probability indicated failure, opposed forces many times larger than themselves, not because they expected to prevail, but because they found the alternative unacceptable. He paused. We have observed this behavior at the individual level, the community level, and the civilizational level. It does not weaken under pressure, it increases. Sixara finally spoke. You are describing a species that does not recognize when to stop. Yes, Orenda said, that is exactly what I am describing. He looked at her steadily. Now imagine that species receiving news that a foreign power has arrived at their border and announced that their home is no longer theirs. He let the silence stretch out. What do you think happens next? Sixara stared at the glowing table. General Orenda's 30 years of campaigns behind him had stopped looking at the files entirely. He was looking at the wall, very still, with the expression of a man quietly reconsidering several assumptions he had held for a long time. I need more time with this material, Sixara said. Take as much as you need, Orendas replied. He moved toward the door. We are not going anywhere, and neither hit. Should be said, are they? He left them there in the soft blue light, surrounded by 40,000 years of data on a species that had survived everything the universe had sent there. Way and was, at this very moment, just beginning to look up. The testimony session was not held in the main chamber. Grand Arbiter Dolenfast had made that decision personally, and no one questioned it. The main chamber was meant for formal proceedings, motions, votes, treaties. What was about to take place was something else entirely. It was a warning, and warnings in the Arbiter's long experience were best delivered in close quarters, where there was nowhere to look except at the truth. The room selected was a secondary council chamber on the station's lower ring, used normally for private negotiations. It held perhaps 30 seats arranged in a curved arc facing a single raised platform. No grand display arrays, no tiered galleries full of observers, just walls, seats, and a light above the platform that made everything below it feel very exposed. The Vreth delegation took their places along the left side of the arc. Sikthera sat at the center of her group, hands clasped on the table before her, expression carefully neutral. After 2 days in the deep archive, she had learned to keep her reactions contained. It was harder than it used to be. The far door opened, and the Keth representative entered. The Keth collective was a hive mind species, billions of interconnected minds sharing a single unified consciousness across a vast biological network. In their natural state, they did not operate as individual bodies. When communication with individual form species was required, they produced what they called interface drones, single physical units grown specifically for direct interaction. The drone that walked to the platform was roughly humanoid in shape, though only roughly. It was taller than most species present, pale gray in color, with smooth features and eyes that were entirely black. It moved with an unsettling evenness, as if each step was calculated rather than natural. It sat on the platform and regarded the room without expression. "I am Unit Sierra," it said. The voice was flat and completely clear, carrying no accent and no inflection. "I am the designated interface for this testimony. I will answer questions. I will not speculate. What I tell you is drawn directly from collective memory, which is complete and unaltered." Dolenfast nodded from the head of the arc. "Please begin with the event of 60 years ago." Unit Sierra looked forward, not at any individual in the room, but at a fixed middle point, as though reading from something visible only to itself. 61 years ago, by current conclave calendar, the Keth Collective authorized a resource extraction operation in the Outer Rim. The target was a human colonial settlement on a moon designated KR7. In our records, the settlement had been operational for approximately 11 years. Population at time of operation, 4,214 individuals. The settlement's primary function was mineral extraction and agricultural support for the inner colonies. The room held its silence. The Keth Collective selected KR because it met all criteria for a low-resistance operation: no military garrison, no warships in orbit, no formal defense agreement with any conclave member. The settlement's communication array was limited in range. We calculated that by the time any distress signal was received and acted upon by human authorities, the operation would be complete. Unit Sierra paused, not for effect but with the mechanical rhythm of something sorting through data. We were incorrect. Sikthara leaned slightly forward. Our fleet entered the system at 300. Local settlement time, 17 vessels. The approach was standard, the settlement's communication array was disrupted within the first 4 minutes. We initiated landing procedures at 03:17. Another pause. The first ground team encountered resistance at 03:41. From whom? General Oren asked. His voice was very careful. Miners, Unit Sierra said. Agricultural workers, 2 medical staff, 1 engineer. Named Carl Gideon, who appears repeatedly in subsequent incident records. Several people in the room exchanged glances. The ground team was neutralized. Oren's mouth opened slightly. By 4,000 farmers. By 4,000 individuals who had spent years operating heavy equipment in a hostile environment, who knew every tunnel structure, access corridor, and weak point in the settlement, and who, according to recovered personal log entries, were, and I am using a direct translation here, extremely unhappy about what was happening. Unit Sierra's tone did not shift. They had no military weapons. They had tools, drilling equipment, excavation charges, pressurized gas distribution lines, maintenance vehicles with considerable mass. They used all of them. The room was very still. By hour 3, we had lost 2 landing craft and 40% of our ground personnel. By hour 6, 2 of our orbital vessels had been disabled. The method was not one our analysts had modeled. The engineer Gideon had rerouted the colony's power distribution system through the atmospheric venting network and used it to generate a directed electromagnetic pulse. He assembled it from components pulled from a grain storage unit. Oren was no longer writing anything. By hour 9, our command systems flagged the engagement for escalation. Review. At that point, we had lost 38% of total fleet capacity and had achieved none of our primary objectives. The settlement was still operational. The population had taken losses but remained organized, active, and by all behavioral indicators, angrier than they had been at the start. Unit Sierra looked at nothing in particular. Our psychological prediction systems, which model anticipated responses in opposition forces and calculate resistance curves, returned an anomalous result. What did it say? Sikthara asked. It said that increasing applied force would increase resistance at a rate that exceeded our capacity to absorb it sustainably. Unit Sierra turned its black eyes directly to her. For the first time, that model had been built on behavioral data from 47 species. In every prior case, increasing force produced increasing compliance. The human data produced the opposite curve. Every additional unit of pressure applied generated a greater return of resistance, not a lesser one. No one in the room spoke. We withdrew at hour 11, not because reinforcements were inbound. We had confirmed that the signal disruption had held and no human military response had been dispatched. We withdrew because our own analytical systems determined that the cost of continuing would exceed any conceivable benefit from the operation. Unit Sierra folded its hands on the table. The collective reviewed the event in full. We updated every relevant operational model. We have not returned to human space. Have you considered returning, Orindas? Asked from the far end of the ark, his voice quiet. The collective does not experience temptation in the way you mean, unit. Sierra said, but due to the intent of the question, no. The review concluded that human settlements are categorically unsuitable targets for any rational operational calculus. Because of the military risk, Sekara said. Because of the nature of the response. Unit C0 corrected. Military risk can be calculated and planned for. What we encountered on KR7 could not be calculated. We were not engaging trained soldiers following prescribed tactics. We were engaging people protecting something they valued. Those are not equivalent things. The drones' expression remained unchanged. A force following orders can be defeated by a superior force. A population that has decided it will not be moved requires a level of sustained pressure that no rational actor can justify, regardless of available resources. It stood. That is the conclusion of the collective's review. That is the full extent of my testimony. Unit C0 moved toward the door. Before it reached it, General Oren spoke. The engineer Gideon, what became of him? Unit C0 stopped without turning. He survived the operation. He received a formal commendation from the human colonial authority. He then filed a complaint with that same authority about the inadequate manufacturing quality of grain storage components, noting that their substandard construction had limited the performance of his device. It opened the door and left. The room sat in complete silence for a long time. Sekara stared at the empty platform. She thought about 17 ships. She thought about 38%. She thought about a man dismantling a grain storage unit at 3:00 in the morning to build something that disabled a warship. Then she thought about 9 billion of them. She turned to General Oren. He was already looking at her. Neither of them said a word. They did not need to. The vote was not close. 47 in favor, 2 abstentions, 0 against. The motion to initiate first formal contact with humanity passed the conclave floor in under 20 minutes, the fastest recorded vote for a decision of that magnitude. The discussion that preceded it was brief and lacked the usual procedural back and forth. There was a shared unspoken understanding in the room that the time for extended deliberation had passed. The reasoning, as Dahlan Fass outlined in his formal statement, was clear. Humanity was advancing. Their space travel technology was improving at a pace the conclave's projection models flagged as rapid by standard developmental timelines. Within 20 to 40 years, human vessels would begin crossing paths with conclave memberships in shared space without any prior framework in place. The first meaningful encounter between humanity and the organized galactic community would be an accident, given what the conclave now understood about how humans responded to unwelcome surprises. Allowing that to happen without preparation was not a risk anyone in the chamber was prepared to accept. Better to go to them planned, organized, honest. Assembling the delegation took 3 weeks. This had nothing to do with scheduling difficulties or political disagreement. The problem was that when the call for volunteers went out, the response was deeply underwhelming. By the end of the first week, 4 names had been submitted, one withdrew the following morning without explanation. By the end of the second week, the list had grown to 11 after Dahlan Fast personally contacted 8 senior diplomats to ask them, with considerable respect, what exactly they were waiting for. The answers varied in language, but were consistent in meaning. Everyone understood the historical importance of the mission. Everyone had also, at this point, either read the deep archive files or heard enough about them to have formed an opinion. In the end, 12 volunteers were confirmed, representing 7 species. They were younger diplomats mostly, individuals who had either not yet encountered the full archive documentation or who had encountered it and reached the specific conclusion that this was either the most significant diplomatic undertaking in conclave history or simply the most compelling way to spend a year. The arbiter made no effort to determine which group was larger. Lead diplomat was a Salandri named Fenn Avra, mid-career, experienced in first contact protocol and known among colleagues for a particular ability to remain composed when situations moved in unexpected directions. She had reviewed the archive files twice. She had attended 3 briefing sessions. She had spent an evening with Oren Duz, who had told her one thing above all others. Be honest with them. Humans, he said, respond very poorly to being managed. They respond well to being respected. She kept that thought with her on the long journey to the outer rim. The delegation positioned itself near one of Earth's automated deep space relay stations, a simple transmitter humanity had launched approximately 8 years earlier. Fenn Avra had reviewed its technical specifications during preparation. The station was compact, efficiently assembled, and contained several engineering solutions the conclaves analysts noted were more refined than expected for a civilization at this developmental stage. She gave the order to open a channel. 6 minutes passed while the translation system synchronized, then static, then a voice, female, brisk, carrying the faint undertone of someone in the middle of something else entirely. This is Relay Station Delta 7. You are transmitting on a restricted frequency. Please identify. Fenn Avra delivered the formal greeting, precisely as prepared, 23 lines, carefully paced, complete. A pause followed. Okay, said the voice. A second pause. Somewhere in the background, something ceramic was set on a hard surface. So you're telling me there are about 50 alien civilizations out there, and you all knew about us this whole time? Not quite a question. Fenn Avra confirmed gently that this was essentially correct. Give me 20 minutes, the voice said. I need to call my supervisor. The channel stayed open and went quiet. The delegation spent those 20 minutes in total silence. Nobody moved particularly much. The Hawk representative quietly asked Fenn Avra if she thought this was going well. Fenn Avra said she honestly could not tell. The voice returned in 18 minutes. Hi, sorry for the wait. My name is Lieutenant Nina Halcott. I'm with the Outer Relay Network. I've been told to keep this channel open while they get the right people together on our end. So a brief pause. Hello, welcome. I suppose. How long have you been out there? What followed was 4 hours and 12 minutes of conversation that would later be entered into conclave records as the most unusual first contact transcript in the body's 4,000-year history. Nina Halcott was not a diplomat, she was a communication specialist who had drawn an early shift on a quiet posting and had not expected her morning to go this way. She handled it the way she appeared to handle most things, by asking direct questions in quick succession and listening closely to the answers. She wanted to know how the conclave governed itself, whether members had ever gone to conflict with one another, how the translation system handled concepts with no equivalent in the target language. She asked about communication ranges, travel times, and whether any member species had a biological requirement for sleep, which she mentioned because she herself needed to be relieved in 4 hours and wanted to ensure someone appropriate was on the channel when that happened. She also asked, without any apparent awkwardness, whether interstellar diplomatic work was physically demanding, because she had a colleague named Owen Burke who was looking for a career change, and she thought he might be good at it. The Hawk delegate stared at the translation array for a considerable moment. After that one, Fenavra answered everything as clearly as she could. By the time the 4 hours ended, a secure link had been established with Earth Central Command. A formal human response team was assembled within 48 hours, diplomats, translators, scientists, and a rotating observer pool drawn from multiple national governments whose coordination the conclave logistics team noted generated a staggering volume of internal documentation. The summary of the first contact conversation was forwarded to the VRETH delegation aboard Orenville. Sikthara read it carefully. She passed it to General Oren without a word. Oren read it, set it down. She asked if we had eaten breakfast. He said she did. During first contact with an alien civilization. Yes. He turned to the next page, and the response team member, a diplomat named Grace Alderton, submitted a formal request during the first briefing for coffee to be made available during interstellar communications because she stated she functioned poorly before 10:00 in the morning. That is in the report. Oren sat back in his chair. I want to go home, he said quietly. Sikthara folded the document and set it flat on the table. Soon, she told him. But I think we should stay because whatever they do next is going to be more interesting than anything that has happened so far. She was right. Earth's official response to the conclave's invitation arrived 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days after the first contact call. In galactic diplomatic terms, this was considered remarkably fast. In human terms, it was the result of what the conclave's liaison observers described in their private reports as the most demanding deliberative process they had ever witnessed, and one of them had previously overseen a boundary renegotiation between two species that communicated exclusively through send. The delay was not indecision, it was process. Humanity had debated the invitation across every available forum, national governments, international bodies, academic institutions, independent research organizations, and a range of public platforms where ordinary citizens had been weighing in continuously for the better part of 18 months. The conclave had never encountered species that conducted its internal political deliberations this visibly. The cultural analysis team spent considerable time trying to determine whether this was a form of remarkable transparency, or a form of organized chaos. They ultimately concluded it was both, simultaneously, and filed a note recommending that future contact protocols include provisions for this possibility. The formal response came from the office of the Secretary General, delivered in person by a senior diplomat named Diana Farrell, who arrived at the conclave's assigned meeting point aboard a human vessel that was modest in size and entirely confident in bearing. Diana Farrell was 62 years old, had spent 4 decades in international diplomatic service, and walked into the meeting room with the ease of someone who had been in considerably more difficult rooms than this one. She greeted Finn Avra directly, extended her hand in the human greeting the delegation had been briefed on, and said with the clear warmth of someone who had no interest in wasting time, "We have a few conditions, nothing unreasonable, but we'd like to go through them properly." She then produced a document. The document was 47 pages. There was a brief collective pause from the conclave side of the table. Diana Farrell noticed it. "I know," she said with something that might have been sympathy, "but you'll find it's well organized." It was, in fact, very well organized. The conclave's legal review team, composed of members from 9 species, spent 3 days going through it in full. Their formal assessment noted that the document was thorough internally, consistent, and contained in several places proposals that the review team felt, after careful reflection, they should have included in the original conclave charter themselves. The amendments humanity proposed were 3 in principle, though extensive in detail. The first concerned pre-contact civilization species the conclave was currently observing but had not yet approached. Humanity's proposal required that any observation of a developing species be subject to an independent ethical review conducted by a body with no strategic interest in the observed world. The proposal also included a requirement that formal contact be initiated within a defined period once a species reached certain developmental thresholds, rather than being deferred indefinitely for political or economic reasons. The reasoning provided in the document was precise: continued observation without contact once a species was capable of detecting that observation constituted a form of deception. The conclave legal team read that section twice. The Second Amendment addressed collective defense. The existing charter contained a mutual defense clause, but it was narrow, heavily qualified, and full of conditions under which the obligation could be waived. Humanity's revision removed most of the conditions. The revised language stated simply that any act of aggression against a conclave member was an act of aggression against all members and would be met accordingly. The document included a detailed appendix clarifying what met accordingly meant in practical terms. The VRETH delegation read that appendix very carefully in full without speaking. The third proposal was different in tone from the other 2, though not in the seriousness with which it had been prepared. Humanity requested the establishment of a permanent cultural exchange bureau, a dedicated body facilitating ongoing exchange of science, history, art, food, and general knowledge between all member civilizations. The proposal included a full operational framework, a staffing model, and a 2-page section on the logistics of safely sharing food across species with incompatible biologies which had clearly been written by someone who had thought deeply about the problem and found it genuinely exciting. When the conclave voted on the 3 amendments, each one passed. The first carried 44 votes. The second carried 48. The third carried 50. Every member present and was accompanied by what procedural records noted simply as a positive general response, which was the most enthusiasm. The conclave's formal language had the vocabulary to express. The membership ceremony was held on the main floor of Orenva in the full chamber with all member species present. Diana Farrell stood at the central podium and spoke without theater. She thanked the conclave for the invitation and the patience of the contact process. She said that humanity did not arrive believing it had all the answers, but intending to work toward better ones alongside everyone in the room. She said it in a plain voice that carried clearly through the translation. Arrays and arrived with a simplicity that the oldest members of the chamber found in their private reflections afterward more moving than any formal address they had heard in a long time. The vote to confirm Earth's membership was unanimous. In the gallery above the main floor, Orinda's watched from his usual seat near the archive-level entrance. He had attended hundreds of membership ceremonies across his 700 years. New members were typically awed or composed with visible effort or quietly overwhelmed. They watched the proceedings with a kind of careful wonder. The human delegation below was different. They were paying close attention. Sharply, completely, nothing missed. But they were also already doing other things. 2 representatives near the back were talking quietly, heads together, pointing at something on a shared display. A younger member of the team, a man named Felix Crane, was engaged in animated conversation with a Hawk Jr. diplomat, both of them gesturing with considerable enthusiasm in what appeared to be a disagreement that both parties were visibly enjoying. Diana Farrell herself had half turned to say something to the aide beside her and was listening to the reply with a focused small nod. They were, Orinda's thought, at home. Not comfortable in the passive sense. At home the way people are at home when they have walked into an unfamiliar place and decided, without ceremony or hesitation, that they belong in it and have work to do. Sikthara climbed the steps to the gallery and stood beside him. She had insisted the Vreth delegation stay for the ceremony. General Oren, after a brief pause, had agreed. She stood at the railing and watched the chamber floor below. After a long quiet, she said, "We were genuinely going to do it." "I know," Orinda said. "We had the fleet assigned. Operational plan was complete. We thought it would take 3 weeks." The old Salandre watched Diana Farrell accept congratulations from the arbiter below. Watch Felix Crane and the Hawk diplomat apparently reach an agreement that had emerged from their argument, both of them looking satisfied. Watch the human delegation move through the chamber not as visitors, finding their footing, but as people who had already figured out where they were going and what they intended to do when they got there. How long would it truly have taken? Sikthara asked quietly. Orendas considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. "I do not know," he said. "That is, I believe precisely the point." Below them, the chamber was filled with movement and sound. 51 civilizations filling that vast space with 51 different languages, histories, and ways of existing in the universe. And the newest ones, Orenda's noted, were the loudest. He found that to his own quiet surprise. He did not mind at all.